Before the world ever collapsed, it changed. Not with fire falling from the sky, not with cities burning or oceans rising in a single night, but with something quieter and far more unsettling. The sky itself stopped behaving the way people expected it to. If you're listening from a dark room tonight, or a long road, or a place where the day has finally loosened its grip, you can let yourself settle here. Tell me where you are, if you'd like. Stories like this were always meant to be shared softly, across distance and time. Now let the present moment fade just enough. Because long before the first great civilizations fell, there were people who noticed something was wrong above them. They did not have telescopes. They did not have equations. They had memory. For tens of thousands of years, the sky had been the most reliable thing in existence. The sun rose. The stars returned. Seasons followed patterns that could be felt in the body. Hunters timed their movements by constellations. Gatherers learned when the land would open and when it would close. The sky was not a mystery. It was a guide. And then, slowly, that guide began to falter. Ancient traditions from distant cultures speak of a period when the heavens no longer felt familiar. Not violent, just altered. Lights that lingered where none had before. Stars that shifted position across generations instead of centuries. A sense that the rhythm overhead was no longer fixed. These are not stories of panic. They are stories of unease. Because the most dangerous change is not the one that destroys immediately. It is the one that forces people to question what they believed was permanent. Some scholars suggest this period coincides with the final stages of the last ice age, a time when the climate itself began behaving unpredictably. Glaciers retreated, sea levels rose, weather patterns destabilized. But alongside these earthly changes, something else appears in the record, a growing fixation on the sky. Suddenly, cultures separated by oceans begin telling stories that start the same way. Not with floods, not with gods, but with signs. A star that did not belong. A path across the heavens that felt intentional. A moment when the sky demanded attention. What makes these accounts unsettling is not their drama. It is their restraint. They do not describe immediate destruction. They describe waiting. Waiting to see if the sky would return to normal. Imagine living in a world where the sky is your calendar, your compass, your clock. Now imagine that calendar slipping, not enough to cause chaos, enough to cause doubt. Children born during this period grew up hearing their elders speak differently about the heavens, with less certainty, with more caution, and caution spreads faster than fear. When the sky changes, people change with it. They begin to gather more closely. They mark time more carefully. They watch. This is where the story of collapse truly begins, not with destruction, but with attention. Because once people start watching the sky for reasons they cannot explain, life becomes provisional, plans shorten, movement becomes deliberate, storage increases. These are not the behaviors of people expecting an apocalypse. They are the behaviors of people who sense instability. The world has not ended, but it no longer feels guaranteed. Archaeological layers from this period show something strange. Not abandonment, but adjustment. Tools become more specialized. Shelters more permanent in some regions, more mobile in others. It is as if humanity was hedging its future, preparing for multiple outcomes without knowing which would arrive. This is a crucial detail often missed. Civilizations did not collapse first. They reorganized. The collapse came later, because the sky did not just change once. It continued to behave differently for generations, and each generation inherited a little less certainty than the one before. Stories that once described a specific sign became symbolic. Memory softened into myth, but the behavior, the preparation, remained. Some ancient records hint that people believed the sky had already delivered its message, that whatever was going to happen had been set in motion. The danger was not sudden impact. The danger was time. Time enough for memory to fade. Time enough for confidence to return. And when confidence returns too soon, collapse follows quietly. This is why the last time the sky changed, civilization did not fall immediately. It unraveled, slowly, across centuries. And by the time the consequences became visible, no one remembered what had first gone wrong. Only that the world no longer felt the way it once had. The sky had spoken, and then it went silent. The silence that followed was not reassuring. It was unfamiliar. For people whose lives were guided by cycles above them, silence in the sky felt like a held breath. Not danger yet, but possibility. In many regions, this was the moment when observation became intentional. Not casual glances upward, but sustained watching. Stone circles appear where none had existed before. Markers aligned to horizons. Simple arrangements meant to track where the sun rose, and where it no longer did. These early structures were not monuments. They were questions made of stone. They asked whether the sky could still be trusted. Across different landscapes, separated by vast distances, similar responses emerged. People began to encode the heavens into the ground, not to worship, to remember. Because when change unfolds slowly, memory becomes the first casualty. Elders tried to explain what they had noticed, but without a single dramatic moment, their warnings sounded uncertain even to themselves. A light that lingered, a season that arrived too early, stars that no longer matched the stories they had been named after. These were difficult things to pass on with precision, and so they were passed on as impressions, a feeling that the world had entered a different phase. This is where ancient calendars begin to matter. Long before writing, people were counting days, lunar cycles, years that felt shorter or longer than expected. Counting was a way to anchor reality. If time could be measured, perhaps it could be stabilized. But the more carefully people counted, the clearer it became that patterns were no longer exact. Glacial melt changed coastlines faster than memory could adapt. Rivers shifted. Lands that had fed generations slowly disappeared beneath rising water. These were not catastrophes in a single lifetime. They were pressures that accumulated quietly. Families moved inland. Communities fractured. New territories were explored not out of curiosity, but necessity, and above it all, the sky continued its altered behavior. Some ancient myths describe this period not as chaos, but as imbalance. A time when the world was slightly out of alignment, not broken, tilted. Scholars debate whether this reflects real astronomical anomalies or human attempts to understand climate instability. But the response remains consistent. Humans did not wait for confirmation. They adapted first. This is the crucial point. Collapse does not begin when systems fail. It begins when people stop believing the systems will hold. Once trust erodes, even subtly, everything becomes provisional. Storage increases. Social bonds tighten. Territorial boundaries harden. The sky's uncertainty echoed downward into human relationships. Who could be relied upon? Who had access to resources? who remembered the old ways. As conditions shifted, older knowledge lost authority. What use was tradition if it could not explain the present? This is how fractures form, not between people and nature, but between generations. Younger humans, born into a changing world, adapted quickly. They accepted instability as normal. Older humans remembered a sky that behaved itself, and that difference in memory shaped decision-making. Settlements that clung to old expectations struggled. Those that experimented survived longer. Archaeological evidence suggests increased experimentation during this time. New tools, new food sources, new patterns of movement. Humanity was improvising, but improvisation carries risk. Without a stable reference point, success becomes temporary. Solutions solve one problem while creating another. And as centuries passed, these small improvisations layered into complexity that required coordination, leadership, rules. The earliest forms of hierarchy appear not during abundance, but during uncertainty. Someone had to decide when to move, when to plant, when to wait. And those decisions carried consequences. When they worked, stability returned briefly. When they failed, suffering followed. This back-and-forth rhythm created a dangerous illusion that human systems could replace natural ones, that if the sky could not be trusted, humanity could trust itself. This belief did not cause collapse immediately. It built civilization. But it also planted the conditions for its undoing, because systems built under pressure are often brittle once the pressure fades. And as the sky slowly returned to more familiar patterns, confidence crept back in. Memory of the original change faded further. What remained were structures, without the caution that had inspired them. And that is when collapse truly began. Not when the sky changed, but when people believed it had finished changing forever. Confidence returned quietly. There was no announcement that the sky had become safe again, no declaration that the danger had passed. There was only familiarity. Seasons began to repeat more reliably. Star patterns steadied. The sun rose where it was expected to rise. For the first time in many generations, people began to relax their watchfulness. And relaxation, while comforting, is the most dangerous phase of recovery, because the structures built during uncertainty were never meant to last forever. They were meant to bridge a transition. Temporary solutions hardened into permanent systems. Food storage became ownership. Leadership became authority. Coordination became hierarchy. The very adaptations that helped humanity survive instability began to reshape society in ways no one had planned. As pressure eased, these systems were no longer questioned. Why would they be? They had worked. Villages grew into towns, towns into early cities. Stone replaced wood. Memory replaced vigilance. And in this shift, something vital was lost. The original reason for caution. The sky had changed once, but now it appeared stable again. So humans began to act as if stability was the natural state of the world. This is where the seeds of collapse take root. Not in disaster, but in assumption. Assumption that patterns will continue, that systems will hold, that yesterday guarantees tomorrow. Ancient records from later civilizations often look back on this period with reverence. They describe a golden age, a time of order, but golden ages are almost always remembered from the edge of decline. They exist because memory edits out the tension that preceded them. What these records rarely mention is how fragile that order truly was. Population increased rapidly as confidence returned. Agriculture intensified. Land was pushed harder than before. This worked, until it didn't. The environment, still adjusting from centuries of change, could not always sustain the new demands placed upon it. Soils degraded, water systems strained, ecosystems that had barely stabilized were pushed again. Small failures began to appear. Crop yields fluctuated, trade routes shifted. Nothing dramatic, just enough to require explanation. And explanations are where belief enters. When systems falter without obvious cause, humans seek meaning. Stories change again. Now the sky is no longer a warning. It becomes a judge. Myths emerge that describe punishment rather than transition. Floods sent because of disobedience. Cold because of moral failure. This is not superstition. It is psychology. When people no longer remember the original instability, they reinterpret consequences through the lens of behavior. If the world is stable by default, then disruption must be caused. And if caused, then someone must be responsible. This is where social fracture deepens. Blame replaces adaptation. Rituals intensify. Rules tighten. Instead of adjusting to environmental signals, societies attempt to enforce order internally, and this is the final turn before collapse. Because systems that punish instead of adapt cannot respond to change. They can only preserve appearance. Archaeological layers, from the end of early civilizations, often show signs of stress before abandonment. Walls built higher, monuments constructed larger. These are not signs of strength. They are signs of anxiety, an attempt to hold the world in place through symbolism. But the sky does not respond to symbols. Neither does climate. As environmental pressures returned, droughts, floods, cold snaps, societies that had lost their adaptive flexibility struggled. Not because they lacked intelligence, but because they trusted their systems more than their senses. And when those systems failed, the collapse did not arrive as a single event. It unfolded as fragmentation. Cities emptied gradually. Trade networks broke apart. Knowledge centralized in fewer hands, then disappeared. The collapse felt sudden only in hindsight. To those living through it, it felt like a series of adjustments that stopped working. The sky had not changed again, but the world beneath it had. And by then, the memory of the original warning was so distant that no one recognized the pattern. They believed they were facing something new. They were not. They were facing the delayed consequence of forgetting why their civilization had been built the way it was in the first place. The last time the sky changed, civilization did not collapse immediately. It collapsed when people stopped believing it ever could. When collapse finally arrived, it did not announce itself as an ending. It arrived disguised as normal difficulty. A few failed harvests. A season that lasted too long. A river that no longer reached the fields it once fed. At first, people adapted the way they always had. They rationed. They traded. They waited. But something was different this time. The adaptations that once worked no longer aligned with the world as it was becoming. Generations earlier, humans had learned to respond to uncertainty with flexibility. Now they responded with enforcement. Laws hardened. Social roles became rigid. Movement was restricted. These measures created the appearance of control, but they reduced resilience. When people cannot move, they cannot adapt. When ideas cannot change, solutions repeat themselves even when they fail. This is why the final stage of collapse is often quiet. No single catastrophe needs to occur. A society can unravel simply by losing its ability to respond. Archaeologists see this pattern clearly in the ground. Layers thin, construction quality declines, repairs replace innovation, homes are rebuilt smaller, tools become simpler, not because knowledge vanished overnight, but because the systems that sustained complexity no longer functioned. As networks broke down, communities became isolated. Local solutions replaced shared ones. In these conditions, memory fragments again. Each group remembers a different version of what went wrong. Each tells a story that centers its own experience. Some remember floods, others remember cold, others remember famine. No one remembers the sky, because by this point, the sky had returned to normal long ago. The original change had already done its work. What remained were delayed consequences unfolding over centuries. This is why collapse myths feel inconsistent. They are not records of a single event. They are memories of different stages of the same long process. The sky changed. Human behavior changed. Civilization rose. Confidence returned. Adaptation hardened. Collapse followed. Each culture preserved the part of the story that touched it most deeply, and in doing so, the full pattern was lost. What survived instead were lessons disguised as morality tales. Warnings about arrogance, stories about disobedience, floods framed as punishment. These narratives are not lies. They are interpretations created after the original cause had faded from memory. When people cannot see the full system, they personalize its failures. They blame leaders. They blame gods. They blame themselves. Rarely do they blame forgotten conditions. And yet, across continents and millennia, the same rhythm appears again and again, not as coincidence, but as inheritance. Civilizations built on the foundations laid after the sky changed inherited both strength and vulnerability. They inherited the ability to coordinate, to store, to plan. They also inherited the tendency to forget why those abilities were necessary. This is the quiet tragedy hidden beneath collapse. Not ignorance, not stupidity, forgetting. Forgetting the context that made civilization viable in the first place. From this perspective, collapse is not the opposite of civilization. It is its shadow, the inevitable result of success without memory. This is why the last time the sky changed, civilization did not end humanity. Humanity survived. What collapsed were the structures that had outlived their usefulness. The people moved on. They adapted again. They carried fragments of old knowledge into new landscapes. And once more, they began watching the sky. Not because they remembered exactly what it had done before, but because something in human instinct told them it mattered. That instinct has never disappeared. It surfaces whenever systems feel too confident, whenever complexity outpaces understanding, whenever stability is mistaken for permanence. And perhaps that is the most important inheritance of all, not the memory of a warning, but the feeling that change does not need permission. The sky does not announce its intentions. It simply behaves. And humans, whether they remember why or not, must respond. Long after the first cities fell silent, people continued to tell stories. They told them around fires. They carved them into stone. They whispered them into the ears of children who would never see a city rise the same way again. In these stories, the world is always stable, until it isn't. The change never begins where people are looking. It begins elsewhere, in the upper air, in distant seas, in patterns too slow or too vast to feel day by day. By the time the ground responds, the cause has already passed. This is why the memory of collapse feels delayed. Civilizations remember endings, not triggers. Archaeologists encounter this delay everywhere they dig. They find cities abandoned, not at the moment of catastrophe, but generations later. They find temples repaired repeatedly, even as resources dwindled. They find desperate continuity long after conditions had shifted beyond recovery. People did not flee immediately. They stayed. They hoped. They tried to preserve normal life as long as possible, because leaving meant accepting that the world they understood was gone. And humans resist that realization more than any other. What changed after the sky shifted was not just climate, it was trust. Trust in seasons, trust in cycles, trust that tomorrow would resemble yesterday. When that trust breaks, civilization enters a fragile phase. Not because people panic, but because they cling. They cling to calendars that no longer predict weather. They cling to rituals that no longer align with harvests. They cling to authority structures built for conditions that no longer exist. This clinging delays adaptation, and delay is the most dangerous response to systemic change. Some societies adapted quickly. They downsized. They decentralized. They returned to mobility. These groups left fewer monuments, but they survived. Others doubled down on complexity. They built higher walls. They centralized power. They extracted harder from diminishing environments. These groups left ruins. From space, the difference is invisible. From time, it is everything. This pattern repeats across history, not because humans fail to learn, but because learning requires continuity of memory. And memory fractures when systems collapse. Each rebuilding phase starts with incomplete information. Each new civilization inherits artifacts without context, stone tools without stories, calendars without skies, myths without mechanics, and so the cycle resumes. The sky changes. Humans adapt. Civilization forms. Memory fades. Rigidity grows. Collapse follows. What makes the last great sky change different is not its power, but its timing. It arrived at the threshold of human potential, just as language stabilized, just as cooperation scaled, just as surplus allowed planning. It forced humanity to accelerate. Some researchers quietly wonder whether civilization would have emerged at all without that pressure. Whether agriculture, cities, and hierarchy were responses, not to abundance, but to instability. If that is true, then civilization is not humanity's default state. It is an emergency adaptation, a strategy for surviving uncertainty. And like all emergency strategies, it works best when the threat is remembered. Once the memory fades, the structure becomes brittle. This raises a difficult question. If civilization arose because the sky changed, what happens when it changes again? Modern humans are surrounded by data. We track temperatures. We monitor orbits. We model probabilities. But knowledge is not the same as wisdom. Wisdom requires humility toward systems larger than ourselves. The ancient stories did not warn about specific events. They warned about forgetting. They warned that the sky does not owe humanity consistency, that nature does not guarantee stability, that progress without awareness becomes vulnerability. The sky changed once. It will change again. Not necessarily violently, not necessarily suddenly, but inevitably. And when it does, the question will not be whether humanity survives. It always has. The question will be, which structures deserve to survive with us? As you rest now, listening in the quiet hours, consider how many worlds have ended without noise. How many civilizations collapsed not in fire, but in silence. How many people lived through the consequences without ever knowing the cause? The sky does not leave signatures meant to be read easily. It leaves patterns. And patterns only reveal themselves over time. Perhaps that is why ancient people watched the heavens with patience. Not fear, not certainty, just attention. Because attention is the first defense against forgetting. And forgetting has always been the real collapse. There is a quiet moment that arrives after every great disruption, not immediately after the event itself, but after life resumes. Fields are planted again. Shelters are rebuilt. Children are born into a world already altered. To them, the new conditions feel normal. This is how memory dissolves. The generation that survives a sky shift carries fear in their bones. They remember hunger without understanding, cold that arrived too early, rains that failed without warning. But they struggle to explain it. Language bends under the weight of forces too large to describe. So they turn to metaphor. They speak of gods who turned their faces away, of heavens that fell, of fires and floods sent as judgment. These stories are not inventions. They are compressions. Attempts to store vast, complex experiences inside symbols that can survive time. And symbols are fragile containers. Each retelling smooths edges. Each generation simplifies. Each culture reshapes the warning to fit its own worldview. Eventually, the event becomes myth. The cause disappears. Only the outcome remains. A flood without a trigger. A fire without a source. A fall without a push. This is why ancient collapse stories feel incomplete. They were never meant to be technical records. They were emotional ones. They preserved fear, not data. And fear alone cannot guide future adaptation. Across the ancient world, we see the same pattern repeat. After environmental instability, societies invest heavily in permanence. They build in stone. They align monuments with the sky. They codify law. They formalize ritual. These acts feel like progress, but they are also defensive. Stone resists erosion. Calendars resist uncertainty. Law resists chaos. Civilization, in this sense, is a memory prosthetic. A way to stabilize meaning when the natural world becomes unreliable. But stability has a cost. As systems grow more complex, they require predictability to function. Bureaucracy needs schedules. Agriculture needs seasons. Trade needs routes that remain open. When the environment shifts again, these systems struggle to bend. Small societies adapt by changing shape. Large civilizations resist until resistance becomes collapse. This is why many ancient cities show evidence of stress long before abandonment. Storage facilities expanded. Granaries deepened. Walls thickened. The response was always to fortify, never to simplify. Complexity feels like control, but complexity increases fragility. The sky does not negotiate with complexity. It ignores it. What ancient people sensed, without instruments or equations, was that the sky operates on scales beyond human planning. They watched stars return to the same positions, until one year, something felt off. They noticed seasonal drift, animal migrations changing, ice lingering where it shouldn't. These observations were subtle, but subtle shifts accumulate. By the time disaster becomes visible, adaptation options are limited. This is why many collapses appear sudden in the archaeological record. They weren't. They were delayed. Delayed recognition. Delayed response. Delayed acceptance. Modern civilization believes itself different, more informed, more prepared. Yet the psychological pattern remains unchanged. We respond fastest to immediate threats and slowest to gradual ones. A single storm mobilizes action. A slow shift in averages does not. Ancient societies faced the same challenge without global communication. They could only compare memory, and memory fades quickly when daily survival resumes. Some traditions attempted to counter this. They encoded warnings into ceremony, annual rituals reenacting destruction, stories told at specific times of year, architectural alignments forcing attention skyward. These were not religious excesses. They were memory anchors, ways to ensure that forgetting required effort. But as generations passed without catastrophe, these practices lost urgency. They became symbolic, then decorative, then irrelevant. And when the sky changed again, the warnings were still present, but unread. There is an uncomfortable implication here. Not that ancient people were naive, but that awareness alone is insufficient. Knowledge must remain active. It must be practiced. Otherwise it decays into trivia. The last great sky change forced humanity to invent civilization. The question that lingers, quietly, is whether civilization remembers why it exists. Not as a story, not as myth, but as a response to instability. As you listen now, resting between waking and sleep, imagine a future archaeologist examining the remnants of our own world. They will see vast structures, intricate networks, records beyond counting. But will they see understanding? Or will they see another civilization that mistook permanence for protection? The sky does not announce change loudly. It whispers first. It nudges patterns. It waits. Those who survive are rarely the strongest, but the most attentive. And attention, once lost, is difficult to recover. There is another silence that appears in the record of collapse. It comes after rebuilding begins, long after survival is secured, after new routines form, after memory settles into something comfortable. This silence is not absence. It is certainty. The certainty that what happened will not happen again. Ancient people did not believe the world ended permanently. They believed it reset. And resets imply boundaries. Once crossed, stability returns. This belief is comforting. It allows people to plan far ahead, to invest in permanence, to assume the rules are fixed once more. But the sky has never promised finality, only motion. When the last great sky change reshaped the world, it did not create a new stable era. It created a transitional one where humans learned to live inside uncertainty by pretending it had ended. This pretense worked for a time. What followed was an explosion of creativity. Agriculture spread rapidly. Villages turned into cities. Writing appeared almost simultaneously across regions. This sudden coordination has puzzled historians for generations. Why did so many societies reorganize at once? Why did symbolic systems become complex so quickly? Why did hierarchy harden so fast? One possibility, rarely spoken outside quiet academic circles, is that civilization emerged under pressure. That early cities were not celebrations of abundance, but mechanisms of control during instability. Control of food, control of labor, control of memory. Writing was not poetry at first. It was accounting. Records of grain, records of labor owed, records of distribution during scarcity. These are the fingerprints of stress, not leisure. The sky changed. Resources became unpredictable. Humans responded by inventing systems that demanded obedience to function. Civilization did not emerge gently. It emerged urgently. And urgency leaves scars. Once stability appeared to return, these systems did not dissolve. They entrenched. Power consolidated. Surplus accumulated. Distance grew between decision-makers and those affected by decisions. This distance created blind spots. Blind spots toward the environment. Blind spots toward vulnerability. Blind spots toward repeating patterns. By the time the next disruptions arrived, regional droughts, floods, cooling events, many societies were too rigid to respond. Collapse followed. Not because humans lacked intelligence, but because they trusted their systems more than their senses. This trust is visible in ruins, cities rebuilt repeatedly in flood zones, fields replanted despite declining yields, monuments expanded even as populations shrank. These were acts of faith, faith in continuity, faith that the sky had finished changing, faith that collapse was a past event, not a recurring one. Ancient myths sometimes preserve a different truth. They speak of cycles, ages that rise and fall, worlds destroyed and remade, humanity restarting with fragments of memory. These stories are often dismissed as symbolic exaggeration, but symbols often survive where data does not. Cycles are easier to remember than timelines. They require less precision and offer more warning. The danger of cycles is complacency. If destruction is inevitable, why adapt? If renewal always follows, why prepare? Ancient cultures balanced this tension uneasily. Some leaned into fatalism, others into control. Few found equilibrium. As modern listeners, we are not separate from this story. We are inside the same pattern, surrounded by systems that assume stability, guided by models built on recent history, comforted by averages that smooth extremes. Yet the sky does not obey averages. It obeys physics, and physics does not care whether a civilization is prepared. The ancient world learned this the hard way, not once, but repeatedly. As you rest now, consider the possibility that civilization is not a destination. It is a phase, a response to specific conditions. When those conditions change, the response must change too, or fail. The last great sky change ended one way of life and forced another into existence. The next change, whenever it comes, will ask the same question again. Not whether humans can survive, but whether they can remember. As the story approaches its quiet end, there is one final shift to notice. It is not in the sky, not in the ground, not even in the ruins. It is in perspective. When ancient people looked upward after the great changes, they did not see catastrophe alone. They saw continuity. The same stars returned. The same constellations traced familiar paths. The sky, altered though it was, still moved with rhythm. This mattered, because it reminded them that disruption does not erase order. It reshapes it. The heavens did not fall silent after the last great impact or climate shift. They did not stop turning. They did not abandon humanity. They simply continued, indifferent to expectation. And in that indifference, ancient people found a strange kind of grounding. They learned to build stories that could survive instability, not stories of control, but stories of meaning. Meaning does not require permanence. It requires continuity of attention. This is why so many ancient traditions emphasize watching. Watching the sky, watching the seasons, watching subtle change, not to predict disaster, but to remain aligned with motion. Civilization, at its healthiest, mirrors this stance. Flexible, observant, aware of limits. Civilization, at its most fragile, forgets motion. It assumes equilibrium. It confuses recent experience with universal law. And when that happens, collapse feels sudden, even if the warning signs were present for generations. The last time the sky changed, civilization did not vanish everywhere. It fragmented. Some groups carried forward pieces of knowledge. Others carried rituals. Others carried skills without explanation. Together, these fragments eventually recombined. New cultures emerged, different from before, but shaped by what survived. This is why history feels discontinuous, because it is. Not a smooth line, but a braided one. Threads break. Others persist. Some disappear entirely. What remains is never the whole, only what could move. As you rest now, drifting closer to sleep, consider that humanity has always lived between knowing and not knowing, between pattern and surprise, between memory and forgetting. The sky has changed before. It will change again. But change does not mean erasure. It means rearrangement. And rearrangement always leaves traces. The ruins we study are not warnings of doom. They are reminders of adaptability, of resilience born from attention, of civilizations that ended, yet gave rise to others. Perhaps the real lesson is not to fear collapse, but to fear rigidity, not to seek certainty, but to cultivate awareness. The ancient people did not survive because they knew what would happen. They survived because they accepted that they did not. And that acceptance kept them watching, listening, adjusting. As the night deepens around you and the noise of the day fades, let that idea settle gently. That history is not a record of endings, but of continuations in new forms. That the sky's changes are not punishments, but reminders of scale. And that humanity's story is not defined by what was lost, but by what learned to move forward, slowly, quietly, again and again. And somewhere beneath the stars, the sky continues its motion, unaware of the stories told beneath it, yet shaping them all the same. Rest now. The story does not end. It only pauses. For those who remember to watch, the quiet settles. The sky turns. And the long night carries the memory forward. The pause after a story is often more important than the story itself. It is where meaning settles. Ancient listeners understood this instinctively. They did not rush to conclusions. They allowed silence to do its work. After the great changes, after the migrations and rebuilding, after the first cities rose again from unfamiliar ground, people did not speak loudly about the past. They spoke carefully, because they sensed that naming something too precisely could give the illusion of control. Instead, they left space. Space for interpretation. Space for forgetting and remembering in equal measure. This is why the most enduring ancient knowledge feels incomplete. It was designed that way. Not because they lacked understanding, but because they respected uncertainty. A closed explanation invites complacency. An open one invites vigilance. The sky taught them this. It never explained itself. It simply moved. Those who learned to live well beneath it did not demand answers. They cultivated attention. Over generations, attention turned into tradition. Tradition into ritual. Ritual into culture. And culture, when healthy, remained flexible. But flexibility is fragile. It must be renewed constantly. Without renewal, it stiffens into certainty. Certainty resists change, and resistance creates breakage. The last great sky change did not destroy humanity. It tested memory. It tested whether humans could carry lessons forward without hardening them into dogma. Some succeeded. Others did not. History remembers both. As you lie here now, suspended between waking and sleep, Notice how this ancient tension still exists within you. The desire for answers, the comfort of closure, the unease of not knowing. Sleep itself is an act of trust, a willingness to let go of vigilance, knowing you will wake again. Ancient people trusted the same way, not blindly, but gently. They trusted that paying attention today increased the chance of adapting tomorrow. They trusted that stories, even imperfect ones, could carry wisdom forward. And they trusted that the sky, however indifferent, would continue to turn. The last time the sky changed, civilization collapsed in some places and quietly transformed in others. The evidence lies scattered across continents, in buried shorelines, in abandoned cities, in myths that feel older than language. These are not warnings meant to frighten. They are reminders meant to orient, to remind us that change is not an interruption of history, but its engine, and that survival has never depended on prediction, only on responsiveness. The night deepens. The world slows. Breath evens out. Somewhere above, the sky continues its patient motion, unconcerned with names, unconcerned with endings. It has changed before. It will change again. And beneath it, humanity will continue to do what it has always done. Notice, adapt, forget, remember, again. For now, there is nothing to solve, nothing to conclude, only the quiet understanding that history is still moving, even while you rest. Let the silence hold that thought for you. Let the stars keep their distance. And let sleep arrive gently, as it always has. Beneath a sky that never truly stands still, there is a moment, just before sleep fully takes hold, when thoughts loosen their grip. Ancient storytellers valued this moment. They believed it was when memory passed most easily from one mind to another. Not through instruction, but through resonance. They didn't end their stories with answers. They ended them with stillness, because stillness invites the listener to carry the story forward in their own way. After the last great sky change, after the long migrations and quiet rebuildings, after the myths were spoken and the stones were set in place, life continued in ordinary ways. People woke. They gathered food. They cared for one another. History did not feel dramatic from the inside. It felt incremental. Days stitched together by habit. Seasons adjusted slowly. What felt like collapse in hindsight felt like endurance in the moment. This is easy to forget when looking backward. We see patterns compressed. We see timelines collapsed into pages. But living through change is always slower, messier, less certain. Ancient humans did not know they were living after a great sky change. They only knew that things were different and that they had to keep going. That knowledge shaped them more deeply than any explanation could have. It taught patience. It taught humility. It taught attentiveness without obsession. Perhaps this is why the deepest ancient wisdom is so quiet. It does not insist. It suggests. It invites. It leaves room for the listener to meet it halfway. As you drift further now, notice how the body understands this instinctively. Breath slows without instruction. Muscles release without effort. Thoughts thin out on their own. This is not collapse. It is transition. A gentle one. The same kind ancient people learned to recognize in the world around them. The sky shifts. The body rests. Life adjusts. Nothing ends all at once. It moves, and we move with it. The last great sky change did not erase humanity. It refined it. It asked a question that has never stopped echoing. Can you remain aware without demanding certainty? Can you adapt without losing meaning? Can you remember without becoming rigid? These questions were never meant to be answered. They were meant to be lived. Tonight, there is no urgency, no warning, no collapse to prepare for. Only the quiet continuity of breath and the slow turning of a sky that has always changed and always will. Rest now. The story has done what it needed to do. It has returned you to attention without fear. And in that attention, sleep finds its way naturally. The deepest endings are often the quietest ones. They do not announce themselves. They simply arrive, the way sleep does, the way dawn eventually follows night. Ancient people understood this rhythm without naming it. They did not divide time into neat conclusions. They experienced it as flow. After the sky changed, after the long adjustments and subtle losses, life did not wait for certainty to return. It moved anyway. Children grew into adults who had never seen the world before the change. For them, the altered sky was simply the sky. The shifted seasons were simply seasons. Memory lived only in fragments, in stories told without urgency, in rituals performed without explanation, in quiet instincts passed down through habit. This is how history truly survives, not as dates, not as events, but as orientation, a way of standing in the world. The last great sky change did not leave humanity with answers. It left it with posture, a posture of watching, of listening, of knowing that stability is temporary and attention is permanent. Even now, thousands of years later, that posture remains within us. It appears in moments of quiet unease, in the sense that something larger is always moving beyond our view, in the instinct to look upward when things feel uncertain. These instincts did not come from nowhere. They were shaped by ancestors who learned, slowly, painfully, that the world can change without asking permission. And that survival does not come from certainty, but from responsiveness. As the night settles more deeply around you, there is nothing left to hold on to from this story. No lesson to memorize, no warning to decode. Only a soft awareness that humanity has been here before. That change has passed through us before. That forgetting and remembering are both part of the same cycle. The sky has changed. It will change again. And between those moments, life continues quietly. One breath, one generation, one story at a time. Let that be enough for tonight. Let the stillness do the rest. The world turns. The sky drifts. And sleep arrives. Not as an ending, but as a gentle continuation. There is nothing left to add now. Only space. Ancient storytellers knew when to stop speaking. They understood that meaning settles best when it is not pushed. After the last great sky change, after the fear and adaptation, after the rebuilding and forgetting, life returned to something quiet. Not simple, not safe, just lived. People stopped scanning the horizon every morning. They stopped measuring every cloud. They trusted the rhythm enough to rest. And rest, too, was survival. Because vigilance without pause becomes exhaustion, and exhaustion dulls attention faster than ignorance ever could. So they learned to sleep again, under a sky that still moved, under stars that still shifted, slowly, imperceptibly, under seasons that were never quite the same as before, but close enough. This balance between watchfulness and rest became the unspoken inheritance, passed not through stories alone, but through the body, through the instinct to pause, to breathe, to wait. Even now, when the world feels vast and uncertain, that instinct remains. It appears when the day ends and the lights dim, when the mind loosens its grip, when questions stop demanding answers. Sleep is not escape. It is alignment, a small rehearsal of trust in motion. The ancient sky changes did not teach humanity to fear the heavens. They taught humanity to live without guarantees, to accept movement, to expect change, to remain adaptable without panic. That lesson did not arrive as a rule. It arrived as a feeling, a quiet understanding that returns in moments like this, when the story fades, when the room grows still, when thought softens into sensation. There is no final conclusion, because history does not conclude. It pauses, rearranges, and continues. The sky turns. The earth breathes. Humanity listens, sometimes carefully, sometimes not. And for tonight, that is enough. Rest now. The story will be here when you wake. The night has a way of closing stories on its own, not with certainty, not with final words, but with quiet acceptance. Ancient listeners would have recognized this feeling, the sense that nothing more needs to be said, only allowed to settle. After the great changes, after the skies shifted and the old certainties dissolved, humanity learned something subtle, that not every moment demands understanding, that not every mystery needs to be solved, that some truths work best when they are carried gently, without weight. The people who came after the last great transformation did not live in constant fear of the sky. They lived in awareness of it. They planted knowing harvests could fail. They built knowing cities might not last. They told stories knowing details would blur. And still, they lived fully. This is perhaps the most enduring inheritance of all. Not monuments, not calendars, not myths of destruction, but the ability to continue with care. To notice patterns without being ruled by them. To remember collapse without expecting it at every turn. To rest beneath a sky that has changed before and will change again. As you drift now, closer to sleep than thought, there's nothing left to carry forward consciously. The body understands what the mind no longer needs to hold. Breath slows, muscles release, awareness widens, then softens. Somewhere above, the sky continues its long motion, unconcerned with endings, unaware of stories, faithful only to movement. And beneath it, humanity does what it has always done. It adapts. It forgets. It remembers again, quietly, over time. Let the stillness take what it needs. Let the rest remain unspoken. This is not the end of the story. It is simply the place where listening becomes sleep. The final moments of a story are not meant to be filled. They are meant to be emptied. Ancient voices would fade here, not because the tale was finished, but because the listener was ready to carry it alone. After all the watching, after all the remembering, after all the quiet adaptations that followed the sky's change, life returned to something ordinary, not unchanged, not innocent, but steady enough to breathe within. Morning light still arrived, night still followed. People still looked up, sometimes without knowing why. The great transformations of the past did not leave humanity with instructions. They left it with instincts. Instincts to pause, to notice, to soften when certainty grows loud. Instincts to sense when systems become too rigid, when stories harden into rules, when attention drifts too far inward and forgets the wider world. These instincts do not speak in words. They surface as feelings, a subtle unease, a pull toward silence, a desire to step back and observe. They surface most clearly at night, when the world slows, when the noise recedes, when the sky becomes visible again. This is where the ancient memory still lives, not in fear of catastrophe, not in expectation of collapse, but in awareness that nothing remains fixed forever, and that this impermanence is not a threat. It is a condition of life. As sleep settles more fully now, there is no need to hold on to the story. It has already done its work. It has reminded you, quietly, that humanity has moved through uncertainty before. That change has come and gone and come again, and that between those moments, people have always found ways to live, to rest, to dream. Let the sky turn without your attention now. Let history continue its long motion on its own. You are allowed to sleep. The world does not need watching every moment, and the story will remain, waiting, whenever you return. The last thing ancient storytellers left behind was not a warning. It was permission. Permission to stop listening. Permission to rest. Permission to trust that the story would continue without them holding it. After the great changes, after the sky altered and the world reshaped itself, people learned that attention must come in waves. Watch, then rest. Remember, then forget just enough to live. This rhythm kept them human. Those who watched without resting burned out. Those who rested without watching were surprised. Survival lived in the space between. Even now, that balance quietly guides the body. You can feel it in the way thoughts slow when the lights dim. In the way questions loosen their grip as sleep approaches. In the way certainty dissolves into something softer and safer. The ancient sky changes did not demand constant vigilance. They demanded respect for scale, an understanding that some forces move beyond daily concern, and that awareness does not mean anxiety. It means alignment. Alignment with motion, with impermanence, with the fact that no moment, good or bad, lasts forever. Civilizations collapsed when they mistook stability for permanence. People endured when they remembered movement. Tonight, there is nothing left to track. No pattern to follow. No lesson to extract. Only the quiet continuity of breath and the long, patient turning of the world beyond the walls. Somewhere above, the sky continues exactly as it always has, changing slowly, unannounced, unconcerned, and beneath it, you are safe to let go, safe to sleep. The story has reached the place it was always meant to reach. Not an ending, but a pause, a gentle one. The pause stretches a little longer now, not empty, just unoccupied. Ancient nights were like this, long, uninterrupted, free from the need to conclude anything at all. After the sky changed, after the world shifted, and people learned, slowly, to live inside a new rhythm, there were evenings when nothing needed to be remembered aloud. No story, no ritual, no explanation. Only the sound of wind moving through grass, the faint crackle of embers. The distant sky doing what it has always done. Those moments mattered more than the stories themselves, because they were when the body learned what the mind could not fully explain. That life continues without narration. That meaning does not require constant attention. That awareness can exist quietly, in the background, without effort. This is where the deepest continuity lives. Not in monuments, not in warnings, but in the ability to rest inside uncertainty without fear. Civilizations rise when people believe the world can be shaped. They fall when people forget the world also shapes them. But individuals endure by learning when to act and when to release. Tonight is a moment of release. There is no lesson left unfinished, no mystery demanding resolution. Only the gentle truth that history moves in ways no single generation fully understands. And that understanding has never been a requirement for survival. Attention, flexibility, rest. These have always been enough. As sleep deepens, the story dissolves into sensation. Breath, stillness, weight easing downward. The sky continues beyond thought. The earth holds its quiet pace. And you are free, just for now, to let the watching go. Nothing important will be missed. The world has changed before. It will change again. And between those moments, life continues. Softly, patiently, without needing to be explained. The silence grows comfortable now, not heavy, not empty, simply present. Ancient people would have recognized this as the right place to stop speaking. Not because the story was exhausted, but because the listener had arrived somewhere deeper than words. After the sky changed, after the long arc of disruption and quiet recovery, this was how nights often ended. No final teaching, no summary, just the shared understanding that life was still moving, and that movement did not require constant interpretation. The fire dimmed, voices lowered, eyes closed one by one. Above them, the sky remained vast and unknowable. Below them, the earth held steady enough for sleep. That balance between vastness and grounding was everything. It allowed people to wake the next day without fear, to continue without certainty, to adapt without panic. This balance has never disappeared. It waits beneath the noise of modern life, still accessible in moments like this, when attention softens, when the body releases effort, when thought loosens its need to conclude. The last great sky change did not leave humanity with a final message. It left a posture, a way of standing in the world that accepts motion without resisting it. That posture is still available. You can feel it now, in the ease spreading through your shoulders, in the slowing rhythm of breath, in the gentle fading of questions that no longer need answers tonight. There is nothing else to prepare for, nothing to solve. The story has already returned you to the only place it ever meant to reach. The present moment, quiet, aware, and unburdened. Let sleep arrive naturally. Let the sky turn on its own. Let history continue its long path without your attention for a while. You have listened long enough. Now you may rest. The night holds its shape. Nothing presses forward anymore. Nothing pulls back. This is how ancient endings were meant to feel. Not like a door closing, but like a hand slowly releasing its grip. After the sky changed, after the long seasons of adjustment and quiet endurance, this was the rhythm people trusted most. Work during the day, watching when necessary, and at night, letting the world exist without supervision. They understood something simple and profound, that no amount of attention could stop the sky from moving. But the right kind of attention could teach you when to move with it. And so they slept. Not because everything was safe, but because rest was part of survival. The body learned what the mind could not store forever. That tension must loosen. That vigilance must ebb. That even uncertainty needs pauses. Those pauses are still with us. They arrive when stories slow, when explanations dissolve, when meaning no longer needs words. You are inside one now. Wreath moves on its own. Thoughts drift without direction. Awareness widens, then gently dims. Somewhere far beyond walls and time, the sky continues its patient turning. It does not remember the last great change. It does not anticipate the next. It simply moves. And beneath it, humanity has always learned the same lesson, again and again. Watch when needed, adapt when required, and rest when the night comes. Nothing more is asked of you now. The story has already settled where it belongs, in quiet, in stillness, in sleep. The stillness completes itself. There is no signal to mark it, no sound, no final sentence that announces arrival. Ancient nights ended this way too, not with certainty, but with surrender. After the sky changed, after the world learned new rhythms, people stopped trying to carry everything forward. They trusted that what mattered would remain, and what didn't would fade without harm. This trust was not naive. It was earned. Earned through generations that watched change arrive without warning and discovered that life continued anyway. Sleep became an agreement with the unknown, a quiet acknowledgement that not everything needs guarding, that some things are allowed to move beyond awareness without being lost. You are inside that agreement now. The body understands before the mind does. Breath slows. Weight settles. Edges soften. The story no longer asks for attention. It has already returned you to the same place it always does. A place where history stops pressing forward and becomes background. The sky keeps its distance. The earth holds its pace. And you are free, just for this moment, to let go completely. Nothing more is required. Nothing more is coming. Only rest. The quiet has fully taken over now, not as absence, but as balance. Ancient people believed this was the moment when stories stopped belonging to the speaker and began belonging to the night itself. After everything that had changed, after the sky shifted, after certainty dissolved, after life found a slower rhythm again, this was how the day was released. No conclusions, no lessons repeated, just trust. Trust that what needed to remain had already settled where it belonged. Trust that awareness could rest without danger. Trust that the world did not require constant holding. The sky has always continued without permission. So has sleep. And beneath both, the human body has always known when to let go. You are allowed to let go now. The story has reached its natural stillness, not an ending, but a resting place. Breath moves softly. Thought drifts away without resistance. The night carries what remains. Nothing more needs to be said. Nothing more needs to happen. Just rest, the pause remains, unbroken, unhurried. At this point, ancient storytellers would no longer consider this telling. They would consider it holding. Holding the listener in a space where nothing more is required. After the great changes of the past, after the sky altered and life reshaped itself again and again, this was the final skill humanity learned. Not how to predict, not how to control, but how to rest without fear. To trust that the world could continue moving, even while awareness softened. To trust that forgetting for a while was not a failure, but a necessary rhythm. The night understands this instinctively. It does not ask questions. It does not demand conclusions. It simply deepens. And as it deepens, the body follows. Breath becomes quieter. Thought thins. Attention loosens its grip. Somewhere far beyond this moment, the sky continues its long turning, unmarked, unconcerned, patient. And here, beneath it, there is nothing left to do, nothing left to understand. Only rest, only stillness, only the quiet continuation of life, carried forward without effort. The stillness holds. There is no new direction for the story to take now, because it has already arrived where it was always meant to end. Ancient storytellers believed that when words began to repeat themselves, it was a sign to stop. Repetition meant the listener had crossed from listening into resting. After the sky changed, after the long arc of adaptation and forgetting, after the rebuilding and quiet continuation, this was the final wisdom that remained: that not everything must be carried forward consciously, that some understanding belongs to the body, not the mind. That rest is not the absence of awareness, but its gentlest form. The sky continues without narration. History continues without witnesses. Life continues without explanation. And you, here in the quiet, are allowed to do the same. There is nothing unfinished, nothing waiting, only the calm rhythm that has always existed beneath every story. Breath in, breath out. The night remains. The world turns, and sleep, patient, unforced, arrives on its own. The night completes its arc. Nothing more needs to be carried forward. Ancient listeners would have understood this moment without being told. They would have felt the story loosen its hold. Not because it was finished, but because it had already arrived where it belonged. After the sky changed, after memory thinned and life found a new rhythm, this was how knowledge was allowed to rest. Not sealed, not concluded, simply placed gently into the background of living. The world does not wait for stories to end before it continues. The sky keeps turning. The earth keeps breathing. Life moves on quietly, whether watched or not. And so now you are free to drift, free from the need to listen, free from the need to remember, free from the need to understand. Sleep takes over the work of holding. The story fades not into silence, but into rest. The ancient people did not believe the world ended when the sky changed. They believed it shifted. That life did not stop, but rearranged itself quietly. Cities fell, not in fire, but in patience running out. Knowledge fractured, not all at once, but over generations. Memory thinned, not because people forgot, but because survival demanded forward motion. What remained was never the whole story, only what could move. The sky has changed before. It will change again. And every time it does, humanity is forced to answer the same question in a new way. Not what happened, but what do we carry forward? Ancient people did not survive because they understood the sky. They survived because they learned to live beneath it, without certainty. They watched, they adapted, they rested, and then they watched again. Perhaps that is the quiet truth hidden beneath every ruin and forgotten myth. That civilization does not end when the world changes. It ends when attention does. The sky is still moving, and somewhere beneath it, humanity is still learning how to notice. Nothing more needs to be said. Let the night take the rest. What remains hardest to accept is not that civilizations collapsed. It is that most people living through them never understood why. They experienced the effects, but not the cause. The harvest failed. The rivers shifted. The cold lingered longer than expected, but the sky itself remained distant, unreachable. And so the explanations turned inward. Blame moved through social structures. Leaders were accused of losing favor. Priests were accused of misreading signs. Communities fractured over interpretation. Collapse rarely arrives as agreement. It arrives as disagreement. When conditions deteriorate slowly, certainty becomes more valuable than accuracy. People choose explanations that preserve identity, even if those explanations fail to preserve survival. This is visible in the final phases of many ancient civilizations. Rather than adapting systems, they reinforced belief. They doubled down on rituals that once worked. They expanded monuments meant to anchor meaning. They centralized authority to reduce uncertainty. These actions felt stabilizing, but they also reduced flexibility. The sky does not respond to belief. It responds to physics. As environmental conditions continued shifting, societies found themselves trapped by their own explanations, too committed to abandon them, too invested to question them. This is when memory becomes dangerous, not because it is lost, but because it becomes selective. Only the parts that support continuity are preserved. Warnings are reframed as symbolism. Practical knowledge becomes sacred myth. Observation turns into doctrine. At this stage, collapse is already underway, not in infrastructure, but in perception. The people who survived did so not because they understood the sky better, but because they were willing to let go of explanations that no longer matched reality. They left. They simplified. They stopped trying to make the old world work. And in doing so, they carried forward something rare: adaptability without ideology. What followed was not immediate recovery. It was silence. Generations without writing, without monuments, without centralized power. From the outside, this looks like regression. From within, it was stabilization, a return to responsiveness. Only after conditions steadied did complexity return. And when it did, it appeared suddenly. Cities rose quickly. Writing emerged rapidly. Social hierarchies crystallized almost at once. This has always puzzled historians. But perhaps complexity did not emerge gradually, because it could not. It required stability to exist. And stability only returned after enough forgetting had occurred. Forgetting was not failure. It was filtration. Only what remained useful survived the silence. Everything else dissolved. This reframes civilization itself, not as a straight line of progress, but as a pulse. Expansion during stability, contraction during disruption, memory thinning and thickening in response. The sky changes, human systems respond, and between those responses, humanity adjusts its expectations. What makes this unsettling is not the past, it is the present. Because the same psychological patterns remain. We still prefer explanations that preserve identity. We still delay adaptation when change feels abstract. We still mistake recovery for permanence. And we still build systems that assume the sky will behave as it has recently. The ancient people did not fail because they lacked intelligence. They failed because they trusted continuity too deeply. They believed the change had already happened, and therefore could not happen again. History suggests otherwise. The sky has never promised finality, only motion.